Welcome to Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A. I'm your host, Joshua Feinberg from DCSMI, the Data Center Sales and Marketing Institute. And I'm thrilled to have you with us for this week's live show, where I address a handful of the biggest sales and marketing challenges that we're hearing about from all over the data center, critical facilities, and digital infrastructure ecosystem all over the globe, literally on all 6 continents. Actually, we have not yet gotten to Antarctica yet. If you have any tips on how we could make that possible, feel free to let us know. And we're thrilled to have you with us, regardless of what your company does in the data center ecosystem. Perhaps you work for a data center operator, like a hyperscale, colocation, edge, modular, or wholesale data center provider, or maybe you do something related to data center technology or data center facilities, or perhaps you're in the segment of the ecosystem that deals with construction, real estate, or investment, or maybe you are in the vibrant outsourced sales and marketing ecosystem. Regardless of what you do on the team, if you have something to do with go-to-market sales, perhaps you work as an SDR, like a sales development or business development rep, or an account executive or account manager, or if your company has an indirect model, if you're involved in channel partnerships, or perhaps you work in product or innovation, or maybe you are the orchestra conductor, the maestro, the executor that is responsible for getting the right people on the team, sitting in the right seats on the bus, rowing the boats at the right tempo, playing your musical instruments at just the right time, from the right score, from the right sheet music. It is incredibly important to have alignment and collaboration. If this is the first time you're joining us, welcome. We're glad to have you with us. If you've been with us before, if you're a frequent flyer, we're thrilled to have you back. And we'd love to know, what do you do in the data center industry? Let us know in the comments on whatever platform that you're watching on. And if you want to make sure that you get notified about upcoming educational events and resources just like this, be sure to subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter, which you can do for free directly on our website. So that way you get notified each Sunday in your email inbox. You can subscribe at www.dcsmi.com. So what is on the agenda for this week? What are the biggest sales and marketing challenges that we're going to be looking at? We're actually going to be jumping all over the data center ecosystem. We're going to start on the facilities side. We're going to look at how a data center energy audit firm reaches the correct buyer persona with the right pain point messaging. After we look at energy audits, we'll talk about data center operators, and in particular, how a data center colocation, managed hosting, and cloud services provider can attract new clients. Next, we'll get into a deep dive on a multidisciplinary part of the data center ecosystem that crosses both technology and facilities, and in particular, how a data center management provider markets and sells enterprise class data backup. And for that particular type of management provider, we know for sure we're talking about one of the 22 different kinds of data center technology business models that are within the broader data center ecosystem. After that, we'll take a real quick break for a message from our sponsor. And in the second half of this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A, we'll look at how to simplify data center equipment, global procurement, logistics, and infrastructure support. After that, we'll talk about how telecommunications and data networking can attract new customers, how a telecommunications and data networking company can attract new customers. And as we head down the home stretch on this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A, we'll look at the biggest of the big, hyperscale, how to win over C-level hyperscale data center decision makers. If you have an idea for a topic or a question or a challenge that you're facing in your business, on your team, or even just you individually, we'd love to know about that and add that to the consideration queue for an upcoming episode. So be sure to leave that biggest challenge that you are facing in the comments on whatever platform that you like to watch. So without any further delay, let's jump right into this week's first topic within the data center facilities segment. How does a data center energy audit firm reach the correct buyer personas with correct pain point messaging? How does a data center energy audit firm, a professional services firm specializing in energy audits, reach the correct buyer persona with the correct pain point messaging? That is a fantastic question. And the first, not so subtle, but important thing to concentrate on is correct is contextual for you and your business. What's correct, what's the right answer for your company may be completely wrong for someone else that you perceive to be a direct competitor, but maybe more like an indirect competitor, meaning that their company is a lot bigger, a lot smaller than yours, or may not be as geographically relevant as yours. When it comes down to energy audits, we know we can do some of it remotely, digitally, virtually, but we know a lot of it requires going on site. So yeah, geography for sure matters within your ideal client profile. So how do we get the right personas and the right messaging for your energy audit firm? What we're looking essentially at trying to do is achieve product market fit and go to market fit, and perhaps even channel partner market fit. Product market fit, and something that started in the early 2000s. People started talking about this among the like SaaS companies, software as a service companies, and the lean startup movement. If you've ever heard of Eric Ries or Steve Blank, his Stanford professor that kicked off this whole idea of running lots of experiments to get really tight on dialing in who the perfect ideal client is for your company, what products and services they purchase from you, at what price points they purchase those at, how often they purchase those at, if it's a recurring agreement, what the duration of the agreement is. In other words, it gives you full product market fit. Achieving that gives you all or at least most of the answers about your core unit economics. So you know things like your average deal size, your average client lifetime value, as long as there's recurring repeat opportunities. Besides your lifetime value, you know your cost of client acquisition, what's often called COCA, C-O-C-A, or sometimes referred to as CAC, client acquisition costs. So you know what a client's worth, you know how much it costs to acquire that client, you know how long they stay with you, you know your gross profit margins, you know your average sales cycle length. You filled in a lot of these blanks about knowing how to satisfy strong demand for a particular segment of the data center ecosystem, and exactly what productized, in this particular case, what productized services they purchase from your firm. So that's product market fit. And for an early stage company, that's a significant milestone that helps you dial into knowing who the correct buyer personas are and how to speak to them, what the correct messaging is relevant for who they are. And most importantly, what they care about, that at some point you need to figure out how. A lot of people, when they're first starting out, just like to talk about how wonderful their company is and their capabilities. But at the end of the day, those are usually topics that most of your buyers don't care about until they're almost ready to buy. So they're like 85, 90% of the way through their buyer's journey. Or early on, when they're just doing research online, they just know that they have some big goals that they need to achieve, some big challenges that they need to overcome. And the better job you do with understanding exactly what those goals are and exactly what the challenges are in their own words, that's incredibly important to getting your messaging right. In the case of a company that's selling energy audits, depending on your company size and depending on their company sizes, your buyer personas, the target roles, the target job functions could line up a little bit differently. What do I mean by that? Well, let's say, for example, you're selling to relatively small companies. Let's say you're selling to data center co-location providers that are independently owned and operated, that have 1 to 3 locations, that maybe have a few dozen employees. In that particular case, you're probably in the US, you'd be talking about a company that maybe has $5 or $10 million a year in annual revenue, or your local currency equivalent if you're located outside of the US. And at that size, if you are selling energy audits, you absolutely positively are going to have a relationship with the CEO of that company. There's no possible way that they're spending even what's probably a mid 5-figure engagement for a basic energy audit, or even a low 5-figure engagement at that company's size, that doesn't cross the desk of a CEO. At the other extreme, if you're selling energy audits to a global data center operator like a company like Digital Realty or Equinix or NTT Global Data Centers or something along those lines, you are almost certainly not going to be interacting directly with the CEO of those companies. Way, way, way down. Usually, it's probably if you're selling these energy audits and they have a regional contract or a global contract, you're probably dealing with a C-level or a vice president or senior vice president or something like that. So those are the two extreme examples. And if you're selling these energy audits to more like a mid-market company that has, in the case of a co-location provider, I don't know, probably somewhere between 10 to 20 data center facilities that has a few hundred employees, all of these are experiments to figure out exactly who these ideal clients are, what they have in common, who showed up on the decision committee. And the way we typically unravel this for an existing company is we look at where you've been most successful. We go to your website, we look at your logos, we look at your testimonials, your case studies and reviews, and we try to reverse engineer into what do those folks have in common? Do they all tend to be located in the same geographic region? In the case of a company like yours that does energy audits, professional services where facilities are involved, you or someone on your team or a contractor that you work with is going on site, likely multiple times during the course of that relationship. So geography matters. I know there are people that operate in the data center facility space that have employees that are on the road more than 50% of the year, meaning they're traveling 26 weeks a year or more. And that is an answer. Typically, to be able to support that, the clients need to be big enough and you need to be big enough, your company needs to be big enough to fund a very, very expensive travel budget. And again, they're paying for some of it, you're paying for some of it. Whatever it is, they're bigger clients to be able to afford to do that. With smaller clients, being able to build a beachhead in one particular country, in a region within the country, in a cluster of countries that are closely nearby each other, usually is a more practical solution for a smaller firm. So the geographic part of the ideal client profile definitely is a big deal. The second part is, as I alluded to just a few moments ago, the buyer persona, the key person that you're dealing with. And again, a buyer persona is a semi-fictional representation of an ideal client based on actual research and some select educated speculation. It can't be all speculation. Research is incredibly important. We can't guess what their words are. We need to know what their words actually are to get the pain point messaging, to get the messaging right. That's incredibly important for having a website that resonates, for having landing pages that resonate, for having lead generation offers, email marketing that resonates, social media posts, paid ads, events, virtual and in person, all of the above. The difference between it grabbing somebody by the virtual shirt collar that's scrolling them by and pulling them in with like, wow, how did they know? And like, who cares? Is getting this messaging right. And the way to get the messaging right is to spend more time nearby your most important core ideal prospects and clients, your primary buyer persona and your secondary buyer persona, your most important economic stakeholder, and the second most important stakeholder that shows up on these decision committees. So again, back to your ideal client profile, how we're defining how we're going to do this targeting at the account level or the company level before we get deeper into the individuals within those accounts at the buyer persona level. So we talked about the geographic aspects of being in the data center energy audit business. What about the company's size aspects? That's an interesting one as well. And again, a lot of it has to do with your firm's size, your firm's business stage maturity, the resources that you have to do business in multiple regions, and their size. So when we get self-aware about the kinds of accounts that you tend to do really well in and the kinds of accounts that you struggle in, we should be able to back into a range of employee sizes as a good fit for your company. So and when we talk about company sizes, all too often people that are in the energy side of the data center ecosystem, of course, are conditioned to thinking about kilowatts and megawatts, and to a lesser degree after that, probably the size, the square footage, the square meters of the data center. And yes, those have a role, but when it comes to prospecting, when it comes to dialing in your ideal client profile, when it comes to messaging, at some point, we're going to need to normalize that with how most modern prospecting tools work, with most often company size that's represented by the number of employees. a particular company has. So like if you use, for example, LinkedIn Sales Navigator or LinkedIn Campaign Manager or Zoom Info or Lucia or any one of those dozens of other tools, company size is almost always represented in number of employees. Some tools will allow you to have a revenue range, annual revenue, annual turnover kind of range, but it's usually employee size. So with that in mind, you know your productized services, you know your offering for your entry-level offering, your entry-level energy audits. Realistically, how big does a company need to be able to afford your entry-level program? Do they need to have, could a company with 10 employees that's doing $1 million or a couple million in revenue or your local currency equivalent afford your entry-level audit? Do they need to have 50 employees to afford your entry-level program? Is your offering sophisticated enough and expensive enough that they really need to have at least 200 employees to be closing in on, I don't know, 50 million in annual revenue to be able to afford your entry-level program? And again, only you can answer that. In bigger companies, product managers spend a lot of time figuring this out, working with a chief commercial officer, working a chief revenue officer. But like at least at a smaller company, at least instinctively, how big do they need to be to afford your entry-level program? And at the other extreme, at what point does a client's size get so big and so overwhelming that their needs around integration, finances, compliance, travel, bench of talent, what have you, are just so overwhelming relative to your company's size that there becomes a finite ceiling on the biggest clients, the biggest data center operators, the biggest end users with their own enterprise data centers? How big of a company can you realistically handle given your company's current resources? Is that ceiling at 10,000 employees? Is it at 5,000 employees? Is it at 1,000 employees? If you're a relatively small company yourself, I wouldn't be surprised to find out that your sweet spot may be 50 employees on the low end and 1,000 employees on the high end or something like that. And if you work in a densely populated area that has a lot of data center operators and a lot of enterprises that own their own data centers, probably have at least a couple dozen or more potential clients that you can do business with just in that particular region. So again, finding the right buyer personas, finding the right pain point messaging is very much an experimentation, iteration thing that really never stops. But when you achieve this state of product market fit of knowing exactly who they are, knowing what they buy, and knowing all the core unit economics, it usually stays constant for a while. But I should warn you that it doesn't stay this, you don't stay in product market fit forever. And it's very likely in rapidly evolving marketplaces and dynamic marketplaces, as their needs change, as marketplaces get more competitive, as you have new entrants, as new forms of competition, your sense of product market fit may erode over time. And then every 6, 12, 18, 24 months, you're more than likely going back to the drawing board and figuring out like, okay, with where we are now, with our company size, with what our core clients are asking for, with where we can win deals with most confidence, where we can provide the most value for them with most confidence, with onboarding, with initial, intended, and extended value, with cross-selling, with expansion revenue, with all the things that powers our company's growth. What do we now know about our core clients that we didn't know 6, 18, 24 months ago? And one thing for sure in the dynamic energy audit firm is we know that power is in very, very short supply on a global basis. So grid availability, site selection, joined at the hip. Alternate energy, whether you're talking about a operator or enterprise that's considering some forms of alternate energy, whether it's natural gas, hydrogen fuel cells, in some small cases, nuclear. There may be some that are powering some secondary systems in the facility using solar, certainly not a core part of that. That all gets wrapped hand in hand with energy. And the first cousin of power and the first cousin of cooling for sure involves conversations around liquid cooling, which, although I first heard people talking about liquid cooling in the mid 2010s, it's really only become a mainstream best practice in our industry in the last 2, 3, 4 years. So this for sure changes the nature of a lot of the conversations that you have if you're getting involved in energy audit with both data center operators and end users with their own data centers, which again reinforces why go-to-market fit, product market fit are not guaranteed once you achieve them to maintain them over time unless you constantly are very closely listening to what the marketplace is saying, and very closely listening to what your most important clients are asking for. And that for sure will change the answers to when you go back and refresh your customer insight research on understanding their biggest goals, their biggest challenges that are directly and indirectly related to data center energy management and the nature of what you do as an energy audit firm. Your definition of your ideal client profile can and most likely will change over time. Your buyer personas, as you tend to move up market, will change and usually become more granular over time. What used to be two different segments that you needed to communicate to educate and build trust with, as you move into larger companies, there may be 4 or 5 different stakeholders that you now need to be dialed into, which may cause you to segment your sales approach, your sales strategy quite differently. It for sure makes you go from having 2 different Who We Help pages on your website to having 4 or 5 different Who We Help pages on your website. It more than likely means instead of having 2 different lead generation offers, 2 different lead generation funnels, you need 4 or 5 different lead generation offers, 4 or 5 different nurturing sequences, 4 or 5 different funnels if you really want to resonate with all those stakeholders. But the key part with all of this is most of your prospects and clients don't want to spend much time with your sales team now until they're almost ready to buy. This is very different than 10 years ago. In the 2010s, it was very common to find that your ideal prospects and clients would use Google and they'd watch a few videos, they'd ask a few questions on social, they'd get about halfway there. At the time, it was 57% of the way through their buyer's journey. They'd be like, okay, I've done enough on my own. I'm ready to schedule a talk with a salesperson. I'm ready to book an initial consultation. I'm ready to book a preliminary audit. I'm ready to, in the case of a data center operator, schedule a tour. Again, you were shut out for the first 57%, but the glass half full is you were in there for the final 43% of the journey. Unfortunately, that is now very much a nostalgic moment, very much in our rearview mirror. 10 years of digital transformation, millions of baby boomers retiring, a lot more Gen Zs and millennials in decision-making roles, and tens of millions of people getting used to working from home in the early parts of the 2020s. And that 57% number has jumped all the way to 83%. In other words, 83% of their researching, comparing options, evaluating pricing, 83% of their decision-making now happens without you in the room. People are so sales allergic. So even if you do everything perfectly, you're only in there for the final 17% of the research and decision-making process. So we have to work extra hard to understand the correct pain point messaging if we want to be able to earn our way in early and often, where we're in early enough to majorly impact the criteria that they use to evaluate all of the different options that are in front of them for retaining the services of a firm like yours for an energy audit. And the unfair advantage, the competitive advantage that you will need to be able to survive and thrive in this kind of environment is getting really dialed into, one, prioritizing who your most important and your second most important buyer personas are. And after that, understanding what's going on in their world. If you've ever heard of the idea of being client-centric, that's what client-centric means, is really, really understanding their biggest OKRs or objectives and key results, what's in their job description, what can cause them to get a big promotion, a big bonus, what can cause them to get the opposite of those events where they lose their job security and potentially career interruption. And on the flip side, what is driving them nuts? What's stressing them out to no end? What are their biggest struggles? What are their biggest challenges that are directly or indirectly related to data center energy management? And when you have clarity on that, it becomes way easier to come up with a go-to-market strategy, a sales and marketing strategy, a content and an educational event strategy that really, really resonates. So those are some of the key considerations that I would be thinking about for a data center energy audit firm that wants to reach the correct buyer personas with the correct pain point messaging. It's not about your pain. It is all about their pain. And the sooner you recognize how important it is to understand exactly what their pain is and how they articulate it in their own words, the more everything starts to improve across the board. That's how a data center energy audit firm can reach the correct buyer personas and using correct pain point messaging. If you're getting good value so far from this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, make sure that you hit the like button on whatever platform that you're watching on to help spread the word. Okay, what do we have up next? What's our next question for this week? So now we're going to jump over from the facilities part of the data center ecosystem over into the world of operators and its first cousin, technology, mostly operators. How does a data center colocation, managed hosting, and cloud services provider attract new clients? How does a company that's primarily in the business of cloud, managed hosting, and colocation attract new clients? That is a fantastic question. And it's one that thousands of data center operators are grappling with right now. A lot of the answer depends on where you can win, what your capabilities are today that are most valuable to a certain kind of client. If your facilities are totally maxed out and extremely power constrained, and you don't see yourself being able to have 600 kilowatt racks in your facility to support ridiculously expensive servers loaded with GPUs from NVIDIA, then more than likely you're going to focus on the same kind of core bread and butter compute and storage business that you have for the last 5, 6, 7 years. At some point, there may become a time and place where some of those facilities become obsolete or premature obsolete, or maybe they have a second life where they can be repurposed for edge because you have a unique competitive advantage with the precise location where this facility is. But those are certainly considerations that come up when dialing in who your ideal clients are going to be. In most cases, the challenging part is when we look at colocation, managed hosting, and cloud services, there could be a very broad range of company sizes that are a good fit for that. Meaning, like with cloud services, in theory, you could be directly or indirectly competing with the big three, with AWS, with Google Cloud, with Microsoft Azure. And a lot of colocation providers thrive in that kind of role. And even within that kind of role, recognize there's all different size companies that are candidates for public cloud, for private cloud, for multi-cloud, for hybrid cloud, all of those different kinds of scenarios. So with that in mind, are there certain company sizes where you are disproportionately more successful than others? And even within cloud services, because you're providing IT infrastructure, there in many cases is an overlay of not just you hitting your bullseye, hitting your sweet spot in terms of company size, but also within industry. And the reason that that's an issue is because in many geographic regions, there's certain kinds of certification, compliance, accreditation, credentialing kinds of investments that a company like yours would need to make to be able to successfully market, sell, and service those kinds of clients, just simply because in that particular region, whether we're talking about doing business with government, education, healthcare, financial services, e-commerce, what have you, there's certain proof of capabilities, certain credentialing that you need to invest in to be successful in those space. So what we're getting at here is the heart of dialing in your ideal client profile. And for a company that is in colocation, managed hosting, and cloud services, there's really two different parts of getting your go-to-market strategy right, of your sales and marketing playbook and that ideal client profile. There are certain kinds of clients, especially on the colocation side, where they favor extreme proximity. The idea of server hugging, server huggers, isn't something that's especially new. I've been talking about it for over a decade now, where clients of all different sizes, all different industries, have a strong preference to choose data center operators that have facilities that are nearby to where their office is, where their facility is, where they work, where they live, so they can get there very quickly if something goes wrong with their servers, with their racks, with their cabinets that are in your facility. At the other extreme, managed hosting and cloud services, those business models can tend to attract people that are more long distance. Sure, they still may want regional proximity for latency reasons, for governance reasons, kind of edge-ish kind of considerations, but usually not quite as precise that they need to be at an exact GPS coordinate, or like they decide they want managed hosting presence and cloud services presence in Europe or in Asia, or more specifically in the UK, or somewhere in the European Union, or somewhere in the eastern part or the northern part of the European Union. They can get specific down to the country or specific down to the city, but they're not so specific that they say, okay, I need a managed hosting provider, a cloud services provider that has a facility that's within a half a kilometer radius of this location in the inner part of London or downtown Manhattan or something like that. That's that ridiculously specific. Now, we're not talking about edge specificity, but we are talking about more regional city metro kind of specificity here. So all of that plays large in how you define your ideal client profile, because there's certain kinds of clients, especially on the co-location side, or maybe 75, 80% of that have extreme geo preferences. And there's some that are specifically buying your location because they're not there, but they need presence there for governance, latency reasons, regulatory reasons, or just having clients or strategic business partners that are located in that general area. So with that in mind, for attracting new clients, more than likely, if you're facilities oriented and colo is the more margin rich, more profitable part of your business, you'd likely anchor into favoring the local, hyper-local marketing and sales a little more than the long-distance sales. But what I'm going to suggest is really going to help you in both particular cases. The first challenge, though, we need to know, did you build all three of these lines of services yourself within your own company natively, or has this come about through mergers and acquisitions? And if it came about through mergers and acquisitions, how tightly integrated are these companies that have come into your world with your core plan? What all of this is trying to get at is, does the exact same kind of client, the exact same kind of ICP, ideal client profile, the exact same buyer personas, are they buying colo, managed hosting and cloud services from you, or are they three distinctly different kinds of buyers? If they're three distinctly different kinds of buyers, you could almost make the argument that you're running three different kinds of businesses that are sharing some overhead, that are sharing a brand. And if you're running three distinctly different kinds of businesses, you more than likely need three different ideal client profiles, three different sets of buyer personas, three different ways of generating leads, nurturing leads, and accelerating and closing those leads into new clients. And the lower the price point is for some of those offerings, and on managed hosting, sometimes, and on cloud services, sometimes the price points can be very, very low, where it's not possible to have a lot of human assist in the sales and onboarding kind of process. But again, only you know the business model that you have. Only you know your product roadmap and your entry versus mid-level price point. But we are seeing with increasing frequency now that companies in 2 or 3 of these core businesses are taking their entry-level businesses, their entry-level products and services that are at very low price points, and deciding that they can no longer afford sales development reps and account executives and account managers working with those kinds of companies one-on-one. So instead, they're making the sign-up process and the onboarding process look a lot more like e-commerce, where it's 100% self-service, self-provisioning, self-onboarding, because at incredibly low price points, it's just not cost-effective to have human beings that are dedicated to pre-sales and post-sales support in those kinds of scenarios. Oh, so with all of that in mind, once you know exactly who these ideal clients are, where they're located, how big or small they are, what industries they tend to be located in, I'm a huge believer in using educational events to educate and build trust with your ideal clients, especially with your core buyer persona. So let's say, for example, you have a handful of different facilities that are all located in the same region, and all or most of these facilities have a conference room, or have a small classroom, or have a foyer where you could potentially host events on a regular basis, say monthly, twice a month, or something like that, with 10, 20, 30 people. The goal with these events is you look at your ideal clients and who's on your target account list and who your prioritized buyer personas are. And once you understand the biggest goals and challenges that those folks have that are directly or indirectly related to being a future client for co-location, managed hosting and cloud services. Once you understand their 5 or 10 biggest goals and challenges, you use those to create an events calendar so you can host an in-person event like a lunch and learn kind of event or a breakfast seminar or something similar in your classroom or conference room once a month for that prioritized buyer persona. So we'll make this real tangible. Let's say for your particular facility, your salesperson or sales team has 400 companies on your target account list. And within those 400 companies, there's 2 different kinds of people that would be ideal for being clients of your company. If you have the bandwidth, I would encourage you to break out those 2 different kinds of people in 2 different kinds of series. Because if they're spending enough and they're big enough and they're big enough opportunities, CTOs, technology executives, definitely like to talk about things that are different than finance executives, assuming that a finance was your secondary persona. In the case of like co-location and managed hosting and cloud services, it's probably just an IT professional. And the secondary, a lot of times, is a channel partner, like a managed service provider or an integrator or consultancy or master agent or something like that. So with all of that in mind, let's say you have 2 different core groups of future prospects of future clients that you want to build awareness with and educate and build trust with over an extended period of time. So you stay with them throughout all 28 touch points in their buyer's journey, throughout awareness, consideration, and decision. So let's say the first Wednesday morning of the month, you host a 90-minute breakfast seminar from 8:30 to 10 a.m. in the morning. When they arrive at 8:30, there's a nice little buffet breakfast spread that's out. You give them plenty of time to network with each other and your team members from 9 to 9:40. You give the most phenomenal, valuable education that helps them with their professional development, their learning and development that's directly aligned with a big goal or a big challenge that you know that particular segment has because it showed up in your customer insight. You bring a fantastic subject matter expert from your team to put together this great deck, this great content, these great best practices that can help them do their job better. If on a particular topic you don't have an internal subject matter expert who can fill in with a 30 or 40-minute talk, you look to your channel partners, you look to your vendors. Nothing wrong with bringing an external guest for that kind of thing. You open it up for Q&A right after that. And for anyone that's interested, you take them on a tour around your facility. Just simply doing this and inviting people from your ideal client profile, from your target account list, from your core prioritized buyer personas on a regular basis will do wonders to dramatically influence how they evaluate their core choices that are in front of them when it comes to picking the next company that they're going to work with through managed hosting for co-location and cloud services, because you're building up know, like, and trust, because you're getting on the short list, because you're staying on the short list, because they're starting to recognize that, wow, you have some really smart people, really friendly people providing unique competitive advantages for a company like theirs, and you're shaping the criteria that they use to evaluate all the different choices in front of them. So by the time they get to the decision stage of the journey, by the time they are in market ready to make a purchase decision, you've indoctrinated them so much about how your team sees the universe, about how other companies that are similar to theirs, not yours, but similar to theirs, and other buyer personas that are similar to that job function, that job title, that role, and that kind of company are navigating these very challenges. You've really, really stacked the decks in your favor tremendously. This is how you earn your way in early and often in a world that's ever increasingly allergic to sales, is transforming your account executives, your sales development reps, from being seen as working for a vendor to instead being seen more like teachers, consultants, subject matter experts, trusted advisors, perhaps even thought leaders. This is how you melt away a lot of the sales resistance. This is how you dramatically accelerate that know, like, and trust educating and trust building. So first week of the month on Wednesday mornings from 8:30 to 10 in the morning, 9 to 10:30, whatever works for you, or you could run this as a lunch and learn series. That's your primary buyer persona. The third Wednesday of the month, 2 weeks later, instead of inviting the IT professionals in these companies, you invite the channel partners in your area. If you have a formal channel program, great. If not, you'll probably do something informal, but either way, guarantee you that the owners, the principals, the leaders of channel partners, of integrators, consultancies, MSPs, agents in your area care about vastly different topics that show up in their goals and challenges than the technology executives in the companies themselves. And when you dial this in, wonderful things start to happen with building these relationships that get great opportunities into your pipeline, and most of all, motivate your ideal prospects, your ideal future clients to want to spend a lot of time with your client-facing team members. So instead of your client-facing team members literally chasing and begging for meetings, it is the other way around. They are a magnet for the perfect people in your community to learn from. And when it comes to a free event, when we do this right, and we say, gee, when it comes to cybersecurity best practices for mid-market CTOs in our region, we know it truly takes a village. There's usually people involved from infrastructure, cybersecurity, operations, engineering, compliance, what have you. So with that in mind, who else would benefit from attending our upcoming event? This is simple email nurturing marketing technology that you've been able to do for well over 10 years. A shocking amount of people still don't do it. It's so inexpensive and so ridiculously powerful. And you know, it starts to work because all of a sudden now, instead of one person from your target account registering for and attending your upcoming event, there's now 5 people from the exact same company that learned about it from each other, maybe learned about it from you as well, but you're helping to proactively drive alignment in the early and middle stages of the journey. Teams that learn together, grow together, you're collectively educating and building trust. Now, for a free event, 5 people register, you're doing well if 3 or 4 of those actually attend. But over time, the better value that they get from attending your events, the more likely it is that as you go to part 2, part 3, part 4 of this monthly series, that you start to see interested companies, interested accounts, bringing multiple stakeholders from those companies. And despite their best intentions, stuff happens at the last minute. So whether they're in-person events or whether you're hosting these virtually, and we'll get to that in a moment, always record. There's always going to be additional people that wanted to be there that couldn't make it at the last minute. There's always coworkers, there's always bosses, there's other decision committee members that should have been there that weren't. So make that recording available for the coworkers, for the colleagues that were not able to attend. And that gives you great content repurposing to fuel the top and the middle and the bottom of your whole content thought leadership engine. Now, I mentioned virtual as well. So like 75-80% of local community hyper-local for running these kinds of events. What about the people where it's not easy for them to drive to your facility to come to a 90-minute event like that several times a year? For those people, you take basically the same slides, the same topic, the same outline, and you run a webinar series, a monthly webinar series. Obviously, if your speakers are tied up at that exact same time, maybe instead of the first and the third week of the month, you run the webinars on the second and the fourth week of the month. And you pretty much do the exact same thing. You take the buyer personas, you take the target accounts, you use your CRM, you use your email marketing database, and you invite them to a webinar version of that. If you want to stagger it, so there's a 3-month delay or a 6-month delay between the in-person and the virtual, so you feel you're not cannibalizing, you could potentially do that, or you can run these at the same time. But again, the idea is that when it comes to colocation, when it comes to managed hosting, when it comes to cloud services, a lot of your buyers will be local. A significant amount of your buyers may be long distance and would prefer to attend on a Zoom or an On24 or go to webinar or something, or stream YouTube live or LinkedIn live event or something like that. So it's the same basic idea, same basic content. They're probably not going to have much networking before, although you could do that in a community forum. Probably logistically difficult to feed them, although we did see during the pandemic people doing all kinds of experiments with sending people gift cards for foods. I want to make sure that people are attending these webinars for the right reasons. So your mileage may vary, but food budget for people attending a webinar probably isn't high on the priority list. What is high on the priority list is making them feel that the time that they invested learning with your client subject matter experts is time extraordinarily well spent. So they feel super comfortable inviting their colleagues to the next part of that series. And so you become a core part of that individual, of that team's professional development and learning development, how they learn to do their job better by studying best practices that are already working for people in similar job roles and similar companies and similar company sizes in that particular region, in that particular industry. So again, record for all the people that intended to attend but weren't able to at the last minute, and that gives you great repurposing. So that's the core playbook. That's what I'd be thinking about for how a data center colocation, managed hosting, and cloud services provider can attract new clients. Lead with education and trust building. We know with colocation in particular, they're often locked into long agreements. 24, 36-month agreements are super common. So we need to be prepared to play the long game. This isn't one and done. That's why I'm encouraging you to think about, once you have that customer insight research on your core buyer personas, and you know their 10 or 15 biggest goals and challenges that they're actively working on. Those are your 10 or 15 topics for the next 10 or 15 months, and tackle them methodically, one a month over the next 10 or 15 months. And in a perfect world, you know which ones are coming up most often, the highest frequency goals and challenges, and order in descending order of frequency. So the most popular, most commonly heard goals, the most commonly heard challenges appear in the earlier months, and the less frequent ones occur in the later months. And what happens when you get to the end of the list? You go back and refresh your customer insight research to see if anything has changed. For sure, you will now have had hundreds, or perhaps more than hundreds, of people register for your events. And you have presumably, on the registration form, asked them what their biggest question is, or the biggest challenges when it comes to co-location, hosting, and cloud. And you've gotten hundreds, if not thousands, of answers. That for sure becomes incredibly valuable research. You've almost certainly had informal Q&A sessions and polling questions and recordings that you can mine this information from. Best practice, I'm sure you, with very high likely, do some kind of post-event survey, again, giving you more data. Roll all of this together, and whether it's 8 months, 10 months, 12 months, whenever you're planning next year's event calendar, you take all of that new research findings into, and you may discover over time that those 2 buyer personas end up getting split up into 3 or 4 buyer personas, because you have a more finely nuanced understanding of who your ideal clients are. But either way, lead with education and trust. They're not buying from a vendor. They're buying from the be-all, end-all experts in your particular region and your particular kind of business model that aligns with who they are, what they care about. And most of all, they see your client-facing team members as teachers, consultants, subject matter experts, trusted advisors, maybe even thought leaders. That's the key unlock to how a data center co-location, managed hosting, and cloud services provider can get the heck out of the vendor box and attract more of the right new clients. If you're enjoying today's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, make sure that you hit the like button on whatever platform that you're watching. And if you have an idea for a topic or a question or a challenge that you'd like to see us address in an upcoming show, be sure to leave that in the comments on whatever platform that you're watching on. Okay, what do we have up next? So now we're going to jump over from data center operators over into the data center technology part of the data center ecosystem. And over at DCSMI, we catalog and track 22 different kinds of data center technology businesses that exist within the broader data center ecosystem. So this particular company is focused on data backup, and they want to know how a data center management provider attracts and sells enterprise class data backup. How does a data center management provider market and sell enterprise class data backup? That is a terrific question and a very timely question. And it's really interesting that you are describing your company as a data center management provider, because if I put one more word in between management and provider, the most natural word, if I was a human version of a large language model, an LLM, anticipating what word comes next, is I would put the word service in between management provider, and I'd end up with a management service provider, or IT managed service provider, what's often known as an MSP, where you're providing potentially anything and everything having to do with IT services to a core group of clients, if they're especially small. As they're larger clients and your company gets larger, you may tend to specialize a little bit more, have a more specialized menu. But managed service providers have been around for literally decades. In the late 1990s, from the 1980s to the golden age of PC LANs and client server, going pretty much up into the early 2000s. These kinds of firms were known as value-added resellers, VARs. I don't know if you know the history of like Mark Cuban, who got famous because of Shark Tank and owning the Dallas Mavericks basketball team in the early 1990s. Mark Cuban actually came from that ecosystem. He originally worked for and then owned a wildly successful value-added reseller, VAR, that specialized in, let's go back into the IT museum here, Lotus Notes. And that's what put him on the map. I actually would come across Mark Cuban's best practices in the early and mid 90s because he was a freelance contributor to a wildly popular trade publication that's actually still around today. I don't know if they still do paper, but I know that in the events and media business, the CRN, which originally was known as Computer Reseller News. Yeah, Mark Cuban was actually a contributor for there. And I remember him sharing what was going on in there. So VARs, computer dealers, computer resellers, computer integrators, computer consultancies, they were around for decades. Starting about 20, 25 years ago, a lot of the companies that were specializing in the IT services more than just selling products morphed into understanding their clients' needs well enough that they could sell productized services to very specific kinds of clients and a very specific kind of business model, usually where they anticipated usage based on the number of users, the number of supported endpoints, and they were able to come up with a fixed price product offering for taking care of either all or a certain subset of what that particular client needed. And that evolved kind of managed service providers. I remember writing a book for Microsoft Press in the late 1990s, early 2000s, where this business model was just starting to evolve, but there was already some of the tools in place like remote management and remote server log monitoring, and that set up the foundation, and obviously SaaS and cloud, and made a lot of these things a lot more possible. So it's very interesting that even fast forwarding all the way through today, you're positioning your company as a managed provider, which more than likely is first cousin of a managed service provider, or maybe the same, depending on how you're actually positioning the company. So what that means is more than likely you're working with data center operators and end clients who have servers and cabinets and racks and co-location facilities that want help with data backup. So in some cases, you may be selling to operators who white label what you're doing and make it available for their clients. In other cases, you're selling directly to end users, and either your staff or your contractors or your channel partners are taking care of the installation and ongoing support of these data backup licenses on servers in either co-located facilities, potentially even hyperscale and edge facilities, or enterprise end users. So you want to know what to do with marketing and selling it. A lot of that has to do with, it isn't just how you position your company. It's how big or small your company is and how big or small their company is. Because the managed service provider model tends to be a lot more popular with selling that to companies that don't have really deep benches of IT talent on their payroll on a full-time basis. So they're using an outsourced IT service provider, an outsourced IT managed service provider to fill that gap. So in some cases, it evolved. It used to be known as like fractional CTO. In some cases, it's still known as fractional CTO, where a company, either an individual within that company or team within that company, basically becomes the outsourced IT department for that particular company. And in the course of providing those core services, data backup is one of a dozen different areas that they may be getting involved in that are directly adjacent to like backup and disaster recovery, BDR, business continuity, data integrity, first cousin of like data storage, deeply entrenched within the data hardware, the data center technology part of the data center ecosystem. So with all of that in mind, in order to get the marketing and sales right, we need to have achieved product market fit and go-to-market fit. In other words, we know exactly who our ideal clients are. We know what products and services they purchase from us. We know the price points, we know the durations, we know the sales cycle length, we know the margins. That's product market fit. Go-to-market fit is we've scaled our sales team enough to know that if an investor comes along and invests several million or tens of million or whatever it is into our business, we know that we're going to have a predictable, achievable outcome because we've gotten really good at recruiting, hiring, onboarding, and scaling up and ramping new account executives, new sales development reps. We've gotten way beyond just founder-led sales. So as long as your company has achieved product market fit and go-to-market fit, you likely have a pretty consistent set of logos on your website and case studies and testimonials and reviews that allows us, when we look at those collectively, and if it's not all there, you may want to go and look in your CRM and talk to your leadership team and try to figure out what your most successful clients have in common, what your most successful channel partners have in common, where do they tend to be located, how big or how small are their companies in terms of average annual revenue turnover, or even better, the average number of employees in their particular companies. And are there certain industries where we tend to do better than others? In the case of data backup, because it's a part of the data center technology ecosystem, there may be a lot of instances that come up where your company can win relatively quickly or get disqualified relatively quickly because there's compliance or accreditation or certification issues that come up with a particular kind of client in a particular geographic region. Like, for example, if you're selling data backup to healthcare or financial services or government or education or something like that, you either have those credentials to be able to sell into that market or you don't. But either way, those are things that need to be represented in your ideal client profile. So we're dialed into where the ideal clients are located, how big or small they are, and what industries they tend to be located in. And just as important, if there's certain industries where we get knocked out really quickly, we need that mentioned in your ideal client profile as well, so that when it comes to ad targeting, when it comes to outbound campaigns, when it comes to your lead generation forms, when it comes to how we set up your filters and your views and your CRM, drop-down lists, all of that can be tied into what we're optimizing for the perfect ideal clients, where we have a lot of clarity over what's going on at the account level. Then within those accounts, depending on how big or small they are, what is our understanding of who the most important economic stakeholders are in those accounts? If you're selling to enterprises, more than likely you're going to need several different kinds of buyer personas to truly understand all the different priorities, all the different kinds of stakeholders that weigh in on data backup, on decision committees on these larger accounts. If you're selling to small and medium-sized businesses, you tend to have fewer buyer personas because people tend to wear a lot of hats. For this particular kind of business, though, data backup, you will almost certainly have an end user buyer persona, and you will almost certainly have a channel partner buyer persona. And it's possible as a relatively early stage company, relatively small company, that may be all you need, but over time it'll probably evolve to be significantly more segmented, more personalized, more nuanced beyond that. And the understanding of who they are and what they care about is what's going to drive your entire marketing and sales engine. In other words, in a self-driven buyer's journey where people are so ridiculously allergic to spending time with sales, we need to earn our way in early and often with the right people in the right places at the right time, and most of all in the right context. So they see your client-facing team members as some of the smartest people on the planet when it comes to anything and everything having to do with data backup for that particular kind of company. In order for us to earn our way in early and often, we need to get out of the vendor box and we need to stay out of the vendor box, which means from a practical standpoint, your prospects and clients need a lot of reason to want to spend time with your client-facing team members in their formative stages when they're doing their research and decision-making process. Because by default, today, Gartner found, and we firm with our own client base, with most of the journey is happening without you in the room. Gartner found 83% of a typical journey, researching, comparing options, and evaluating pricing, now happens before vendor contact, salesperson contact. That means even if you do everything perfectly, you're locked out for the first 83% of the game. Imagine sponsoring a sporting event where you're taking clients, where you're taking employees, where you're taking channel partners to a baseball game, a football match, a basketball game. And for whatever reason, they've decided that sales and marketing people are icky. We know, really cynical, really technical IT buyers are not big fans of us sales and marketing folks. How do we change that perception? So even though our guests are let in for the first 3/4 of the game, for the first 7 innings of the game, so we're not locked out till the end of the game. The way we get invited in early and often is we need to change how our core prospects, how our core clients perceive us. We need to go beyond being seen as account executives and sales development reps and marketers and account managers. We need to instead be seen as experts, as consultants, as trusted advisors, perhaps even as thought leaders on anything and everything having to do with data backup for this particular kind of stakeholder in this particular kind of company. In order for us to have that knowledge and resonate, it changes the nature of who you hire. It changes the nature of how aggressively your company invests in onboarding, reskilling, cross-training, changes the nature of how you segment, how your teams are assigned. It's super common now across data center operators and data center technology and facilities companies to segment their sales and marketing teams by not only company size, but by industry. And most of all, it changes the value and the nature of how you have these conversations to be playing the long game. They need to see your team members, your client-facing team members, as experts. If all they're getting from your client-facing team members is the same exact kind of information that a prospect or client could get from reading your website or watching your explainer video or watching a YouTube video or attending a webinar, and they're not getting any incremental value, that person, that highly technical, highly skeptical, sales allergic person is not going to want to spend much time with your client-facing team members anymore, which is an enormous problem. And you know what the biggest competitor of all is? You know all the money that's flowing into this industry because of AI, generative AI and AI infrastructure? They like spending time with ChatGPT and Copilot and Gemini and Perplexity and Claude more than spending time with a lot of the humans that are on your payroll. And wow, is that an enormous problem? So you're not just competing for attention against what they can learn on LinkedIn and what they can learn from watching YouTube videos and watching podcasts and going to webinars. You are literally competing against the revenue engine that's driving all of the expansion and all of the need for a lot more data backup, a lot more storage space, a lot more capacity in data centers. Let that sink in for a moment. In other words, your client-facing team members need to be better than ChatGPT, need to be better than Copilot, need to provide value at a completely different level. And let that sink in for a moment on what we're actually up against here. So when it comes to marketing and selling, the human part, the emotional part, the emotional intelligence, the empathy, the client centricity is no longer optional. It's the only thing that we have left, building a strong professional brand, bringing a strong commercial brand, bringing a strong brand as being seen as the experts in this particular kind of company, in this particular kind of industry. So you insert yourself into the professional development and learning development process is incredibly important. I'm especially partial in these kinds of environments to getting really dialed into your ideal client profile and your target account list and your buyer personas, and using that information to host on a very regular basis educational events. In the case of data backup, where a lot of your decision makers and stakeholders may be buying long distance, webinars, live streams, virtual summits become a core part of the playbook. In the course of where you have clients that are located nearby to where you have an office, or where you can partner with co-location operators and channel partners that have facilities in your area or do road shows, you could do offline webinars as well. What's an offline webinar? It's a breakfast seminar, it's a lunch and learn. It's basically the same content for the same people, except instead of delivering the content and the interactive part virtually, digitally, long distance, and perhaps on demand, you're delivering the exact same content, but it's in a classroom, in a conference room, in a meeting space, in foyer, whatever it is that is a way for you to get together. And it could be, these don't have to be large events. The conference industry in the data center ecosystem, the data center conference industry has messed up a lot of people's thinking and priorities when it comes to this. They're thinking that they need to be getting in front of hundreds or thousands of people, when in reality, if there's an ICP mismatch, if their demographics don't align with your ideal client profile, it's very likely that 60, 70, 80% or more of the people that are at that conference are a ridiculous mismatch for who you want to be getting in front of. So the reality is, when you distill that down, you're like, okay, there's 1,000 people at this conference, but 800 of them are the wrong people. Like, okay, how do I get to those 200 people? Well, easier said than done. Of course, you can try to set up meetings with those folks. And at those meetings, you're really not doing much education and trust building. In a typical conference, only the top 5 or 10% of the people that are speakers there for editorial reasons are getting to educate and build trust. So you have this needle in a haystack kind of thing going on. The reality is, what we really want an environment where our core ideal client profile, our prioritized buyer personas, are coming to learn from your client-facing team members about topics that are top of mind for them, not what you'd like those topics to be, but what those topics actually are, because you've done your customer insight, you've done your buyer persona research. And when you do this consistently, and when you consistently deliver value, they want to spend time. Your ideal clients, your ideal prospects want to spend time with your client-facing team members. And when you provide a lot of value, and you say, typically this kind of initiative, it takes a village. There's typically people involved from cybersecurity, operations, infrastructure, compliance, finance, what have you. So given that, who else would benefit from attending? When they get a lot of value, they're a lot more likely to forward that message to their colleagues. And all of a sudden you start to see 3, 4, 5 people from the same event coming, from the same company coming to your event and learning together. And you're proactively driving alignments in the early and the middle stages of the journey, in the formative stages of the journey, when they're open to learning about how other companies similar to theirs are addressing their related data backup challenges. So again, for data backup, you're in a category where a lot of this can be done virtually. In some cases, if there's big enough deals, you may get some value from hosting these in person, but a lot of the future of marketing and sales revolves around education and trust building. And the better job you can do with getting in early and often with a monthly series, at the absolute minimum with a quarterly series. Monthly is probably a lot more practical with the 28 touch points they're going to go through between complete stranger and purchase decision. It is incredibly important and core for a company that's in the data center management business, that's selling enterprise class data backup, marketing and selling, to be able to market and sell in a way that reflects their buyer preferences, not what you'd like their buyer preferences to be, not because you'd like them to go back into a time machine and buy the way they did 10, 15, 20 years ago, when fax broadcasts and fax modems and Blackberries and display ads and things like that were a thing, and their inboxes weren't completely overwhelmed with cold email and cold calls. And no, we have to deal with the present day reality. And the present day reality, it's noisier than ever. Extreme relevance, extreme specificity for who they are and what they care about is going to win. And in order to do that, we got to be really, really dialed into who they are and what they care about, and earning our way in early and often as part of a core part of our marketing and sales engine. So that's how I would approach how a data center management provider, first cousin of like a data center managed service provider, can market and sell enterprise class data backup. And that brings us to our halfway point for this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. If you're getting good value from what you're hearing so far, be sure to hit the like button and help spread the word to your colleagues. We're going to take a real quick break for a message from our sponsor. When we come back, we'll tackle 3 more of the biggest sales and marketing challenges that we're hearing about from all over the data center ecosystem.
Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A is sponsored by DCSMI, elevating the role of sales, marketing, and go-to-market GTM professionals in the growth of the data center industry. To stay informed about upcoming episodes, subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter on the DCSMI website at www.dcsmi.com. Again, that's www.dcsmi.com. Now, back to Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A.
Hey there, Joshua Feinberg from DCSMI, the Data Center Sales and Marketing Institute, and you are watching the Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, where each week we tackle a handful of the biggest sales and marketing challenges that we're hearing about from all over the data center ecosystem. And if you have an idea for a topic or a question or a challenge that you, your team, your company are facing when it comes to growing your business in and around data centers, critical facilities, and digital infrastructure, we'd love to know exactly what that is. So be sure to leave that in the comments on whatever platform that you're watching on, and we will add that to the consideration queue of topics for upcoming episodes. So what's up next? Our next question is going to take us into a category of the data center ecosystem that spans both technology and facilities. So the question is, how do we simplify data center equipment, global procurement, logistics, and infrastructure support? How do we simplify data center equipment, global procurement, logistics, and infrastructure support? That is a fantastic question. And it's one that's come up before on the podcast. It's one that's come up before on the Q&A show. And it's one that's come up a few times on the Data Center Go-to-Market podcast that I host. And that reminds me of a couple of interviews that I did with some experts in this space. One is Zach Pena, who owns Empirics Partners, and a more recent interview that's going to be going live in the coming weeks, probably will be live already by the time you're watching this on the podcast version as opposed to the live version, with Noah Sussman from TechX. And both of their companies specialize in different aspects of logistics and supply chain and global procurement. So Zach Pena's got an interesting background. He's retired military that worked for some of the big data center hyperscalers and facilities providers, and started his own firm focusing on logistics and supply chain issues that are unique to building big data center facilities. And if you've never talked to someone and realized the dozens or hundreds of different vendors that are involved in building a data center campus, a data center hyperscale facility, there's a lot of coordination needs to happen at the right time for all the equipment that's going in there on a regular basis. Noah Sussman, interesting business as well. Our company specializes in tariffs and import issues that tend to come up when you're shipping, especially hardware, into dozens of different countries around the world. And a lot of that has to do with embargoes. A lot of that has to do with tariffs and clearing customs and either hardware either selling through or getting stuck and potentially derailing these kinds of projects. So these are just some of the dozens of complex issues, complications that can come up when you're dealing with equipment, global procurement, logistics, and infrastructure support. So what's interesting about the nature of this question is usually most of the questions that come up on this Q&A show tend to focus on marketing and sales and go-to-market issues. And those are usually the kinds of questions that we tend to address. But in this particular case, the reader, the viewer, wants to simplify how they're actually doing the procurement and the logistics and infrastructure support. And the challenge is with all of this is when I talk to experts in this field that specialize in this, what they tend to find is over time, they figure out the kinds of companies that are a best fit for their companies, because in both cases, they're typically selling to companies that are way, way larger than theirs. And when you have a company that's a dozen or 2 dozen employees, or even a couple hundred employees, and you're selling to Fortune 1000 employees, you really have to be dialed into who they are and what they care about and have the resources to be experts on their particular problem, because you're dealing with a much more sophisticated buyer, much more sophisticated kind of decision committee. So more than likely, they're going to follow a very similar process on the account management, on the onboarding, on the service delivery side, as we would with marketing and sales, where you're essentially looking for patterns. In other words, they more than likely have a sense of who their best clients are. They know because they talk about their best clients all the time. They tend to have their logos on their website. There's testimonials and case studies. And when media does interviews with them, those are stories they talk about all the time. With that in mind, they will start to see the pattern recognition, what those clients tend to care most about, the biggest challenges that they're going through. And at the absolute minimum, there's like a version of ideal client profile recognition that comes up to make sure that it's really, really hard for them to simplify procurement, logistics, and infrastructure support if they're selling to dozens of different kinds of businesses in dozens of different kinds of countries. So if you're selling these services related to like being importer of record, IOR, that has to do with getting hardware into dozens of countries around the world, you will literally need a customized version of your playbook for what you do in that particular region for each of these markets. That's why whenever people ask for like insights on how do I expand into new markets, it's way more than just making sure that, okay, well, we've done business in North America, we want to do business in South America. Oh, gee, we'll translate our content into Spanish and Portuguese and we're good to go. It's like, no, it may be completely different kinds of products and services they're looking for, completely different journeys, completely different stakeholders, a completely different maturity stage of the kinds of businesses that you're selling into. So yeah, getting dialed into who these ideal clients are, where you tend to thrive, where they tend to get the best value. There's a lot of parallels between dialing in your go-to-market sales and marketing and dialing in your product roadmap, dialing in your service delivery framework. And a lot of that is getting clarity on where they're located. For sure, as I was just mentioning, there's massive geographic implications to where your company can comfortably do business. If you're a relatively small company, you are likely confining your global procurement, logistics, and infrastructure support to a non-global part of the global marketplace, to just one particular country or cluster of countries that are in close geographic proximity. To truly be able to deliver global solutions, more than likely, your company is going to need global representation worldwide that has presence in these local markets, that's interacting with clients and channel partners in these local areas to get a pulse for what they need and to be able to actively deliver these services around procurement support, logistics support, and infrastructure support. So there's the geographic part of that. The second part of that is I was just alluding to a few moments ago. With these kinds of businesses, again, it's relatively tricky to figure out what are the ideal sizes for these kinds of clients. Now, a company that is relatively, let's say a co-location operator with a couple dozen employees and a few handfuls of locations where it's owner operated, closely held, in the course of selling this kind of engagement, it'll almost certainly get all the way to the CEO or CFO or COO or something like that. Whereas in a global company, you're usually nowhere near that. It's usually like a VP, a managing division director kind of role, managing director, EVP, something like that, that would oversee it at the highest possible level. So dialing in the size has massive implications for not only your messaging, but your targeting, how you're crafting the offering, and the depth and breadth of what you're actually supporting. Industry almost always comes up in the case of ideal client profiles. That's more than likely not going to be as relevant in this particular category, because usually with equipment procurement and logistics and infrastructure support, usually we're dealing more at the facilities level as opposed to running the actual technology. And then, though in the case of the importing of equipment, for sure, there's a lot of technology equipment that's coming in and out, but we're not actually operating the equipment. So the verticals and the industries can matter, but probably not nearly as much as other kinds of business models in the ecosystem. So we need to focus on the right geographies. We need to be dialed in on our size, and we need to know what exactly they want relative to what we can actually deliver. And it takes a while for a relatively young, relatively new company to be able to figure this out. Usually, the reason, however, that you're venturing into this is one or more of your co-founders, one or more of your partners has some directly related or indirectly related experience to doing this for another employer. Like, for example, in the case of Empiric's partner, Zach Pena, that I mentioned earlier, before he went out on his own with his own professional services firm, focusing on logistics and supply chain, he was running similar kinds of projects for big data center operators. Actually, a very common thread that I see across the dozens of people that I've interviewed on the Data Center Go-to-Market podcast is a lot of the people that are in leadership roles in relatively small companies, either as founders or non-founders, what they all tend to have in common is that they were doing that kind of career. They were in that kind of job role for another kind of company, another employer, before they went out into a more entrepreneurial version of that. So simplifying the procurement, simplifying the logistics, simplifying the infrastructure support is seeing the pattern recognition on what's showing up when you do your persona research, on what's showing up when you continue to ask what they're struggling with, what they need the help the most with, and truly understanding who the different stakeholders are. You're going to have a very different conversation with a finance executive than you would with an IT executive. And you're going to have a very different conversation with a IT executive of a small to mid-sized business as opposed to an enterprise-sized business. And you're going to have a completely different conversation with the owner or partner in a reseller, and a value-added reseller or managed service provider, than you would with an end-user enterprise IT executive or finance executive or operations executive or something like that. So knowing your business model, knowing their business model, knowing your company size, knowing their company size, helps you figure out what products and services make the most sense to offer. We're typically talking about, in most cases, a productized kind of a service offering here, and that's what gets you to product market fit. That's what gets you to go to market fit. And it's very unlikely that that stays static over a period of a couple of years. Over time, their needs evolve, your capabilities evolve, new markets evolve, you grow, they grow, you decide to go in same directions, different directions, your team capabilities moving into new regions, new competitors, new in the marketplace emerge, all of the new regulatory environments come up. And for sure, like when we're going from the 2010s into 2020, I'm sure there weren't very many people that anticipated the supply chain issues that were going to come up during the pandemic. Tariffs and changes in political leadership in various parts of the world also can dramatically impact this particular category. It used to be, back in the day when I was a lot more hands-on and in SMB technology support, that supply shortages, component shortages, drove a huge part of logistics and supply chain headaches. Like, for example, memory module shortages, CPU shortages, hard drive shortages, display shortages, regardless of whether we're talking about really, really early generation when it was CRDs or LCDs. All of that has a dramatic impact on how multi-tier distribution, distributors and channel partners and integrators and aggregators were dealing with things, how project management and rollout was actually happening, and environments of all different sizes. But yeah, there's a lot of variables to keep track of. And AI for sure will introduce new tools and capabilities that make it easier for companies in this kind of professional services business to grow and scale faster. For a short while, you may have a competitive advantage. Then others in your space adopt the same kind of tools, and it just keeps ratcheting up your clients' expectations. But I think at the end of the day, for simplifying equipment, global procurement, logistics, and infrastructure support, I'm incredibly partial to setting up an environment that gets you as close as possible to your ideal prospects and clients as you can. And a certain amount of that is happening by just being really good at project management and account management. A certain amount of that happens as well by recognizing that your buyers are very sales allergic, meaning that it's very unlikely that you're spending a ton of time with prospects and clients anymore in the early and middle stages of their research and decision-making process. But it doesn't have to be that way. You don't need to wave the flag and say, okay, we'll be there in the last 17%, but we're okay with being locked out of these conversations in the first 83% of the journey. No, I want you to have a role in those first 83% of the journey, because that's when you can shape all the preferences and the criteria that they use to navigate this incredibly complex category. And the way to almost certainly do that is to insert yourself into those companies and into those stakeholders' role as part of their professional development, as part of their learning and development process. So this is why you see educational events, offline events, lunch and learns, breakfast seminars, symposias, and online versions as well, webinars, live streams, summits, digital kind of events, both live and on demand, training and certification programs, all podcasts, all becoming a huge, huge part of getting in early and often with the right people in the right places at the right time, and most of all in the right context, so you can get the heck out of the vendor box and stay out of the vendor box, so your best prospects and clients see your client-facing team members more as the be-all, end-all experts on anything and everything having to do with global procurement, logistics, and infrastructure support. Where you know this is a particular problem is if you're losing a lot of deals where you're not the lowest bidder. And a lot of times this reaches a boiling point where it gets all the way to your CEO and says, we're fed up with this. We're fed up with our prospects and clients treating us like crap. We're fed up with our account executives being ghosted. We're fed up with the talking down to, the condescension. We are better than that. We have some of the smartest people on the planet, and it is time to let the industry know that we have some of the most talented people on the planet when it comes to anything and everything having to do with global procurement, logistics, and infrastructure support. And the way that starts is almost certainly taking resources away from traditional media and bringing them back into your own internal media. In other words, moving away from 100% of your resources going to paid and earned to having owned media, your own fantastic blog and newsletter, your own fantastic social media, your own fantastic webinar and offline events, your own fantastic solo podcast, panel podcast, interview podcast, multi-session podcasts, and the offline version of that, and all of the above. That's how you start to let the industry know that you are for real, that you have some of the most talented people on the planet when it comes to data center equipment, global procurement, logistics, and infrastructure support. So at a high level, that's how I would approach dialing in the messaging, the go-to-market approach, the playbook for both pre-sales, post-sales, account management, and expansion for a company that's looking to simplify data center equipment, global procurement, logistics, and infrastructure supports. If you're getting good value from this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, make sure that you help spread the word by hitting the like button on whatever platform that you're watching us on. So what do we have up next? What's our next question? Our next topic takes us directly into the data center technology ecosystem. Telecommunications and data networking. So how does a telecommunications and data networking company attract new customers? How does a telecommunications data networking company, data networking provider attract new customers, attract new clients? That's a terrific question. And it's a particularly interesting one because there are scenarios where a company can be a data center telecommunications carrier, a data center technology provider, and not really get involved in the data networking between facilities and within facilities. And there's other cases where companies provide great expertise within the facilities with the cross connects into the meet me rooms, but aren't really involved in running IXs and facilitating carrier neutrality and everything that happens at more of a outside the facility level. But in this particular case, it sounds like this company has core competence in both areas, in both the telecommunications and the data network company. and data networking, and they want to attract new customers. So my first and foremost question on that for attracting new customers is how well these two capabilities are integrated. Because for sure, there are significantly scaled companies that are just carriers, and there are significantly sales companies that just do data networking. They don't have to be joined at the hip, especially when you're talking about data networking that's happening within the facility. But when you're talking about the fiber in between facilities, yeah, it tends to be a little more joined at the hip. And so there's the carriers, and there's another really important part of that ecosystem as well. As a huge part of that ecosystem are the channel partners. These sometimes show up as consultancies, brokers, agents, and they're a huge part of the marketing and sales. And in most cases, they're usually getting paid 100% of their compensation based on closing deals. So they're highly motivated to bring deals over the finish line. And many, or at least and somewhere between many and most cases, the people that have these kinds of businesses, that start these kinds of businesses, are former employees of the carrier. So they know the industry really, really well. And they're usually bringing decades of industry contacts along with them into growing these kind of businesses. In some cases, they work for data center operators, and they recognize that a lot of the core clients that they've worked with over the years from data center operators are also potential clients for needing telecommunications services from telecommunications carriers on a regular basis, whether we're talking about in and out of a data center, whether we're talking about towers, whether we're talking about fiber. And then there's another part of the ecosystem as well that's growing like crazy as well. And that's the marketplace part of this ecosystem. Relatively early on in the life of the Data Center Go-to-Market podcast that I host, I interviewed Ben Edmond, who's the founder and CEO of ConnectBase. ConnectBase has done wonderful things over the last several years of democratizing and simplifying and standardizing the process that companies and channel partners use globally for how they research and procure all different kinds of telecommunications services, and getting a lot more transparency into what goes into speccing out these needs and the costs and bringing services provisioned over the finish line and into commissioned use. So with all of that, when it comes to attracting new customers, it's getting really self-aware about who your best customers are, where you've won the most often. And as we move into a marketplace that really operates 7/24, 365, where the world really knows no geographic boundaries, doesn't really have an off switch anymore. The great part is we can be doing business globally for certain kinds of companies. Like, in other words, you could have a territory where you're selling circuits in New England, the United States. And although most of your clients may be located in New England, you may have clients from all over the US and potentially all over the world that need a circuit somewhere in New England in the United States. So we have global opportunity, but it also introduces global competition. Perfect telecommunications company that has grown like crazy over the last several years that comes to mind is Megaport. Megaport's Australian-based. It's traded on the Australian Stock Exchange. Again, relatively early on in the life of the Data Center Go-to-Market podcast, I interviewed Adam Gibson, who at the time was VP of Development for Megaport. And Adam travels the globe. He since has left Megaport. But Megaport's a really interesting, perfect example of a company that's headquartered in Australia and grew their beachhead throughout Asia Pacific, but is now truly global and has a significant presence in the United States. So it's truly a global business. So with all of that in mind, when it comes to attracting new customers, there's your company's capabilities, what you can deliver today and what's on your roadmap for what you can market and sell successfully. But there's also this recognition that selling in telecommunications and selling in data networking is very different today than it was as recently as 10 or 15 years ago. 10 or 15 years ago, it was still very common to find that although your ideal buyers, your technology buyers, your channel partners were very comfortable using search engines and mobile and cloud for doing research, they would get to about halfway through their journey, their research and decision-making process, and be like, okay, I got it far enough. Now I'm ready to schedule a free consultation. I'm ready to fill out a form, essentially to talk to sales. I'm ready to schedule a tour if we're talking about a data center facility or something like that. They're ready for a sales interaction. So 10 years ago, These were happening at roughly the halfway point. CEB, the corporate executive board that's now owned by Gartner, at the time found that 57% of a typical journey was over before sales contacts. That wasn't too bad. If you did everything right, you were still in there for the final 43%. That, however, is now very much in the rearview mirror. That's a nostalgic moment of, oh, remember when we were still in there for almost half the time. Now we're hardly in there for any of the time. As baby boomers have retired, as Gen Z and millennials have moved into decision-making roles, as we found digital transformation accelerating over the past decade, as tens of millions of people worked from home at the beginning of the 2020s, we now live in a world where nearly all of the buyer's journey is happening self-service. Gartner found 83% of researching decision-making, comparing options, comparing pricing, is happening without you in the room. So even if you do everything perfectly, you're locked out for the first 83% of their research and decision-making process. Imagine taking a group of clients and channel partners to a sports event, a basketball game, a hockey game, a football game, a baseball game, and you get to the stadium and the guests that are going to sit in the suite with you are all allowed in. You arrive a half hour to an hour before the game. So they're enjoying all the hospitality. And they get one look at your business card and they say, whoa, ew, icky. You're a salesperson. You're a marketer. We have a policy. We don't allow folks like that until the fourth quarter, till the seventh inning. You're like, what the heck are you talking about? I'm the person who's paying for this suite, who paid to bring all these in. Like, no. We care about guest experience. We care about their experience. And we know there's some of your coworkers that are just selfish jerks. They're narcissists. They just want to talk about how wonderful they are. They're getting overly aggressive in their pitch. We don't want you messing with the guest experience at this game. So no, you're going to have to sit over there on that bench in our lounge outside the stadium, and we'll allow you back in when the game is 3/4 of the way over. That is what's happening. Probably not in that arena or sporting event analogy, but that's essentially what's happening with your buyers, is they've gotten so sales allergic that there is a crisis of trust that now pretty much locks you out of nearly all of the journey unless you're able to reposition yourself. And what does repositioning look like? Well, we need to get you out of the vendor box. We need to get you out of being seen as just another account executive or account manager or sales development rep that's working for a carrier or a data networking company. And instead, your prospects and your clients need to see you more like a consultant, a teacher, a subject matter expert, a trusted advisor, maybe even a thought leader. And this changes the nature of how companies are going to be hiring going forward. It changes the nature of how aggressively you need to be investing in your own professional development, how supportive your employer needs to be of upskilling and cross-training and cross-skilling. Because if you're just reading the information to your prospects and clients that they can find on their website, that they can find by watching an explainer video, that they can find by attending a webinar, it's pretty much game over. We need to level up. And the bizarre reality with all this is all the jet fuel that's coming into this industry, all the incredible amounts of demand that's fueled by AI adoption, artificial intelligence adoption, and particular generative AI. The generative AI tools, ChatGPT, Copilot, Gemini, Perplexity, Claude, they're your competition, because highly cynical, highly technical, skeptical IT buyers in many cases are enjoying spending more time with ChatGPT than they are with getting value from spending time with your sales team, with your marketers. And that is an enormous problem. So if we want to attract new customers, new clients, and new channel partners, we need to provide more value than they can get from the self-service tools, which almost certainly the direction that we're seeing most of the data center ecosystem moving in, both with operators and technology and facilities companies, is the domain expert, is the industry expert. So it used to be that sales teams a lot of times were carved up by deal size, by company size. So reps would sell to SMBs, small and medium-sized businesses, also sometimes known as SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises, not to be confused with the other kind of SME, a subject matter expert. So they would carve up by size, by small business, mid-market, and enterprise. Now within those sizes, especially within mid-market and enterprise, we see companies divvying up territories, sales teams by industries. So you're the expert for your company, or you're working on a team within your company that just sells telecommunications and data networking to healthcare, or just sells telecommunications and data network and financial services, or manufacturing, or government, or education, or something like that. And what you tend to find is most of the people that are being hired into that roles, that thrive in those roles, come from having decades of experience and decades of contacts in that particular industry. In some cases, they were already selling into those kinds of accounts. In some cases, they were technologists or supporting technologists in those particular industries. But either way, they understand all the events, they understand the ecosystem, they understand the roles, and in most cases, they're bringing hundreds, if not thousands, of contacts along with them that they've built up over the course of their career with former customers, former prospects, former colleagues, coworkers, and channel partners. So it changes the nature of even how we build our go-to-market playbooks, how we build our sales and marketing playbooks to be relevant. So instead of being seen as someone that's working for a vendor, you're seen more as a peer. In terms of technical expertise, you don't necessarily have to be all the way at the level of like the CTO. You could be seen as having similar expertise to someone that would work in that CTO's organization, but rest assured, you will not have credibility to have those kinds of conversations if your technical skills aren't at least where an entry to intermediate level hire is for someone that's working full-time in that kind of company. So we see increasingly account executives spending a lot of their nights and weekends, downtime, travel time, commuting time, bulking up on certifications, training and certifications that can help improve their professionalism, improve their perceived value to outrun the attractiveness of their buyers spending more time with ChatGPT than spending time with a human like yourself. So this is a big part of attracting new customers. I'm still very partial to events. I think a huge part of the industry is doing events completely wrong. What do I mean by that? Is in a self-driven buyer's journey where 83% of the action is happening without you in the room, we need to get you back in the room. And the way we get you back in the room is education and trust building. When you go to a conference and there are 1,000 people at the conference and there are 50 people that are speaking at that conference, 5% of the conference, and they each bring along 2 coworkers, that means there's 150 people at that conference who are either a speaker or a coworker of the speaker. So 15% of that conference can educate and build trust at that event. The other 850 people that are at the event are there to absorb the education and trust building. There's another 150 or 200 people at that event spread across 50 booths that are there to try to interrupt the attention of the people that came to learn and network at the event. They're not getting to do much education and trust building. Perhaps they get a couple minutes of meaningful conversation and they can get someone at a future date to agree to come to either in person or virtually an education and trust building environment. And the rest, the other 80% or so, the other 70% or so, people that are at the event, you're just there as the product. Without you being at the event, there's no reason for the speakers to show up. There's no reason for the exhibitors, for the sponsors to show up. So again, 85, 90% of the people at a typical event are not getting to do education and trust building. So even if there was a near perfect ICP match, an ideal client profile match against your ideal client profile and their demographics, 90% of the people don't have a chance to do any kind of education and trust building. I want you to be in the education and trust building business. That's the key part of your go-to-market marketing and sales engine going forward, which means that instead of getting enamored with, whoa, they have hundreds or thousands of attendees at this event, 80% of which are not my ICP anyway. And whoa, they have some big name speakers. Unless you're one of those big name speakers or one of your colleagues are, you're not getting anywhere near the education and trust building. The good news for your board and your CFO and your CEO is you can do education and trust building for a fraction of the cost of these high waste kinds of environments where you're throwing away a ton of attention and chasing your tail and being commoditized. If your company has a conference room in its offices, in its facilities, if it has a classroom where you can host 10, 20, 30 people at a time for small educational events, you are in a fantastic position to educate and build trust. How does this work? You dial in your ideal client profile, you have your target account list, you have your prioritized buyer personas. You know, for those prioritized buyer personas, let's keep it super simple. In this case, we have a IT/telecommunications executive and we have a channel partner. For the IT telecommunications executive, we do our buyer persona research and we figure out their 5 or 6 biggest goals, their 5 or 6 biggest challenges. We have 10 or 12 topics, and once a month for the next 10 or 12 months, we're going to invite hundreds of people from those 100 or 200 target accounts. We probably say, for argument's sake, we have 100 or 200 target accounts, and there's 5 or 10 people that matter in each of those target accounts. So maybe there's 500 or 1,000 email invites that go out, and we're looking to get a dozen, 2 dozen, 3 dozen of those people to register and attend our in-person event, where we're going to talk about a topic that is top of mind for that IT telecommunications executive in that particular company. How do we know what topic is top of mind? How do we nail the relevancy? Because we've done our homework, we've done our buyer persona research, and we know there are 5 or 6 biggest goals that show up in their OKRs, their objectives and key results in their job descriptions, that are standing between them and a promotion and a big bonus. And we know there are 5 or 6 biggest frustrations and challenges when it comes to telecommunications and data networking. And we tackle one of those systematically once a month over the next 10 or 12 months. Then we take our channel partner buyer persona, say, for example, the primary buyer persona, the first Wednesday of the month, we're doing a breakfast seminar. The third Wednesday of the month, 2 weeks later, we do the same thing for our channel partners. And maybe you mix it up, and sometimes you do breakfast seminars, sometimes you do lunch and learns, because we know sometimes people prefer first in the morning, sometimes people prefer more midday. A lot of it has to do with proximity and the nature of their job responsibilities. We do not need large numbers to move the needle. If your conference room seats 20 and you have 5 or 6 people, or even 3 people from the same company attending, 2 or 3 of which are on that decision committee or directly report to someone on that decision committee, it doesn't take a lot to move the needle when they see you as the be-all end-all expert when it comes to anything and everything having to do with telecommunications and data networking. And you'll know this is working well because they're getting so much value from your educational events that by the time it comes to part 2, part 3 of this series, you notice that they took your lead, and when you sent them the email and say, who else should attend when it comes to this particular issue, cybersecurity for mid-market manufacturing firms in our region. We know it takes a village. There's people involved from operations, infrastructure, security, engineering, compliance, finance. So with that, who else from your team would benefit from attending? Simply hit the forward button. And you know this works because you look down at your registration roster and you get clusters of people from the same company all registering. And it's a free event, so probably not going to get 100% attendance rate, but significant amounts are attending. Teams that learn together, grow together, and you're proactively driving alignment in the formative stages of the early and middle parts of the buyer's journey. So again, with your secondary persona, with the channel partners, segment them out. They care about different topics, and maybe do that the third week of the month. Experiment with different times of day at different days of the week. And you could run the exact same playbook to your long distance prospects as well that can't easily drive to your facility, where you run basically the same content in a webinar or in a virtual summit or in a live stream or all of the above. But again, the overriding goal with all of this is we need to put you and your client-facing team members in a position where they can educate and build trust. Sponsoring a cocktail party, not going to get that done. Taking people to a ball game, not going to get that done. Having a fantastic golf tournament sponsorship, not going to get that done. A little bit of trust, but if you bring out a slide deck at the ball game, during the ball game, at the cocktail party, at the golf tournament, you're not going to be the most fun person to be in the round, and they're going to be like rolling their eyes, and you probably will do the opposite of building up the brand that you want, that you're trying to. So we need to be seen as an extension of their professional development and learning and development process. And when you do this well, they spend a lot of those 28 touch points with you. And when you do this well, you start to see multiple people from the same company attending and learning together, and a lot of fantastic things start to happen with growing your pipeline, with growing your sales opportunities, because you've successfully escaped the vendor box. And we've gotten you to stay out of the vendor box because you're building this transformative relationship with the right people and the right companies at the right time, and most of all in the right context. So when it comes to attracting new customers for telecommunications and data networking, they see your client-facing team members as some of the smartest people on the planet. So that's how I'd approach, that's what I'd be thinking about for how a telecommunications and data networking company can attract new customers. And that brings us to our final question that we're going to be addressing in this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. If you've been getting good value from this week's episode, make sure to hit the like button. And if you have an idea for a topic or a question or a challenge that you think we should address in an upcoming show, be sure to leave that in the comments as well. So what do we got? What's our final question? How do we win over C-level hyperscale data center decision makers? How do we win over C-level hyperscale data center decision makers? So you're a data center operator, you're providing hyperscale facilities for hyperscale buyers. So the good news is you're doing massive deals. The bad news is you're doing massive deals. It's just a completely different kind of context. So what that means is when it comes to defining your ideal client profile and your target account list, there is likely only a few dozen companies on your target account list. That's good and bad. For the most part, good. And these are huge deals. These, in most cases, are 6-figure, 7-figure deals, maybe even significantly more that, or just for your local currency. That means that we can afford to invest considerable amounts of resources in lead generation, lead nurturing, education, and trust building. The downside is there's a reason we need to invest considerable resources into cost of client acquisition costs as part of your core unit economics. The reason we need to invest these kinds of resources is there typically are a lot of people that are ultimately going to weigh in on a hyperscale data center long-term agreement, long-term lease, whatever you want to call it. In some cases, these leases are so huge that it's going all the way to the board and the CEO of your prospects and clients' companies. So what I would encourage you to do is, if your company is already established, we need to look at where you've won most often. There's probably logos somewhere. There's probably case studies and testimonials, even if you don't have that level of transparency on your public-facing digital presence. At the minimum, this stuff is in your CRM. So look in your CRM, talk to your chief revenue, chief commercial officer, talk to your chief finance officer, figure out who the best clients are, who are the most profitable, and who you want more of. With that in mind, that'll help you dial into where they tend to be located, how big or small they are. But again, we're typically talking about a couple of dozen different kinds of companies who would potentially want to take either a huge part of your facility, a huge part of your campus, or the entire part of your facility, the entire part of your campus. So when it comes to winning over the decision makers, the bigger these deals are, the more I want to remind you that it's very rarely one decision maker anymore. Even in smaller companies, everyone has gotten so ridiculously risk averse in the last couple of years. Even if you manage to get a warm introduction to the person that will ultimately have to greenlight and sign off this, no one in their right mind for a hyperscale deal is letting you anywhere near that sign off until you have gotten alignment, gotten consensus among the key C-level, among the key executives, among the key stakeholders and team members in that company that need to sign off. And the bigger the deal is, the more likely it is that it's even crossing multiple departments. So the first unlock with all of this is to recognize that there is no magic decision maker anymore, even though there obviously is one person in these huge deals. It's probably a CEO or CFO who's going to sign that agreement. But there are potentially dozens of different people that are going to need to weigh in and be on your side to make this deal actually advance. So from our target account list, at the account level, at the company level, who do we need to educate and build trust with? Those are your personas, your buyer personas. And in the case of a hyperscale deal, we're not talking about 2 or 3 or 4 different kinds of stakeholders. There could be 5 or 10 or more different kinds of stakeholders that you need to win over. They call this, years ago in the SaaS ecosystem, they came up with this term called multi-threading. What multi-threading means is that your account executives, your senior account executives, are capable of having multiple conversations going on at once to proactively drive alignment across this massive opportunity. Actually, the future of being an enterprise account executive in many ways looks a lot more like being a quarterback, looks a lot more like being a project manager that helps your internal champion drive alignment across their team and multiple teams within the organization. And being that you're selling to extraordinarily technical, extraordinarily skeptical, sales allergic kinds of stakeholders, they're not going to have a lot of patience for people showing up that don't understand their world and that don't demonstrate an understanding of the world. And in a self-driven buyer's journey, where nearly all of researching, comparing options, and evaluating pricing now happens with you being locked out of the room, the only way in most cases for you to earn your way back in early and often is by being seen more as a teacher, consultant, a subject matter expert, a trusted advisor, maybe even a thought leader. And this is not easy to do for a lot of companies. This is a big cultural shift. They don't want to spend time with account executives and sales development reps and account managers. They want to spend time with people that understand their world, understand what they're trying to do, and can be helpful expert resources at making that happen. So this is why we see increasingly companies changing the kinds of professionals that they're hiring into these roles to work on these hyperscale deals. The reality is your account team that's working on these needs to, by definition, have technical skills that rival someone that could be a fractional CTO nights and weekends to small and medium-sized businesses. And I'm not going to tell you which specific vendors, training and certification programs that you should load up on, because it varies depending on the nature of who you're targeting, where you're located, how big or small resources are. But I am increasingly seeing account executives that are using training and certification as a leveling up and credentialing way for them to earn their way back into better conversations. Because most of the conversations that you will want to have and need to have around building sales process and reaching C-level hyperscale decision makers comes down to extreme trust with the right people opening up, taking you behind the curtain to their side of the table to tell you what is really going on. And that's not going to happen if they think the only value that you can add is reading your website to them. If the only value you can add is reading your slide deck to them. No, they need to see you as a peer. They need to see you as someone that has enormous credibility for having worked with other similar companies, other similar kinds of stakeholders in recent months and recent years on other similar kinds of initiatives. And the better job you can do with that through content marketing, through podcasts, through educational events, both offline and online events, all of that puts you in a position of being able to educate and build trust. And that's the key unlock with all of this, is winning over decision makers isn't just mapping the org chart. Obviously, there's great tools that can help you start to dig into that. But the reality is there is a lot of hidden decision makers. LinkedIn and Edelman did some transformative research a couple months back that talks about the role of these hidden decision makers that you don't even know exist. And the reason you don't know exist is because they don't interact with your sales team. Most often, the way to influence how they look at your category is through thought leadership content. And in order to empower your internal champion to have a chance at advocating for you, your internal champion needs to have the right tools to advocate for you. And in most cases, in nearly all cases, that comes down to thought leadership resources. So at the end of the day, understanding who they are and what they care about, it isn't just enough to have a surface level understanding of the obvious decision makers, of the obvious members of the decision committee. On these large hyperscale deals, it's possible that there's 6, 8, 12 different kinds of stakeholders that you need to win over to make this happen. The better job you understand of how that's divvied up, and the better job you do of truly multi-threading and supporting your internal champion, not only getting consensus across their own team, but across all the other different teams in the enterprise that need to weigh in, the better job you're going to do with advancing deals. From a tactical perspective, outbound can be really good for this. LinkedIn Campaign Manager, the ads platform, can be fantastic for this. But if you don't have anything meaningful to say, if you're not educating and building trust, if everything is one selfish ask after another, you're not going to get very far in that account. So at the end of the day, especially if you're a smaller company that doesn't have the brand recognition of a Fortune 1000 data center REIT, real estate investment trust, lead with education, lead with trust building as the way for you to unlock more of the right stakeholders in the right companies at the right time, in a way that they see your client-facing team members as some of the smartest people on the planet when it comes to anything and everything having to do with how that particular job role in that kind of company navigates the different hyperscale data center choices that are in front of them. So that's how I would evaluate. That's how I'd figure out how your company can win over C-level hyperscale data center decision makers, regardless of your business model and regardless of the right size. So that is the final question that we're going to be addressing in this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. If you have an idea for a topic or a question or a challenge that you or your team or your company is currently facing, we'd love to consider adding that to the agenda for an upcoming episode, an upcoming installment of Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A. So be sure to leave that in the comments on whatever platform that you're watching on, and we will add your topic to the consideration queue for upcoming episodes. If you want to stay in the loop, if you want to get invited to upcoming educational events and get access to educational resources like this, be sure to subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter that you can do for free directly on our website, so you can get notified to your email inbox each Sunday. You can subscribe for free directly on our website at www.dcsmi.com. I'm Joshua Feinberg, founder of DCSMI, the Data Center Sales and Marketing Institute, and host of the Data Center Go-to-Market podcast. If you and I are not currently connected on LinkedIn and you'd like to be, feel free to send me a connect invitation. And it's very important to make sure to mention in that connect invitation that you've watched and that you're a fan of Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A. Why is it so important? Because just like you, I get avalanched with hundreds of connect invitations every single month. And unfortunately, a lot of them are not contacting me for anything but their own adjacent, tangential, selfish reasons, so that I can put you to the front of the line and accept your connection request. Make sure to mention that you've watched this live show and that you're a fan of this live show. So glad that you're able to join us for this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. And we wish you great success in growing your company's influence, your team's influence, and your own career trajectory in this great period of opportunity within data centers, digital infrastructure, and critical facilities. Enjoy the rest of your day. Enjoy the rest of your week. And we wish you great success in the coming days, weeks, and months. See you back next time. Take care now.
Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A is sponsored by DCSMI, elevating the role of sales marketing and go-to-market GTM professionals in the growth of the data center industry. To stay informed about upcoming episodes, subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter on the DCSMI website at www.dcsmi.com. Again, that's www.dcsmi.com.